She sold my truck for $500 while I was at the hospital with my sister. She never thought to look underneath, and what she sold along with it was worth more than her house. I am Doreen Calloway. I am 71 years old. The November light came in through the kitchen window cold and pale that morning, and I stood at the sink with my hands in the dishwater and did not say a word. 43 years of marriage built that truck into what it was. One afternoon proved how little she understood of the people she had married into. There is something about an old vehicle that holds a marriage in it the way nothing else quite can. My husband Earl bought that 1976 Ford F-250 the year before our son Wesley was born, and he drove it every day until his back finally gave out. He passed 2 years after that, on a Sunday morning in April, and the truck stayed in the driveway because I could not yet bring myself to move it. It sat under the carport with the keys still on the hook by the back door, and I would sometimes go out and run my hand along the dented fender just to feel the cold of the metal under my palm. That truck had carried us through every season of our life together. Earl had welded most of it back into shape himself over the years. He was a welder by trade, and a careful one. He believed that a thing worth owning was a thing worth fixing, and he believed that some things you fixed in a way other people would never think to look for. I live in a small farmhouse on the edge of Roane County, Tennessee, on 12 acres my husband and I bought in 1981 from a man who told us the soil was no good and we would never grow anything on it. We grew tomatoes and beans and 3 children on that soil, 2 of which we lost early, and Wesley, who lived. The house has a tin roof that sings in the rain and a wraparound porch that needs painting and a view of the foothills out the back kitchen window that I have looked at for so many mornings I no longer notice it unless someone visiting points it out. Most people in town know me as the woman who keeps to herself and who shows up at the church potluck with a casserole dish but does not stay long. That has always suited me fine. Wesley married Brittany 7 years ago. She is 34, blonde, and very good at the kind of smile a woman uses when she is calculating something behind it. I do not say that meanly. I say it because I have watched her for 7 years now and I have learned the rhythm of that smile. Wesley loves her. That has been enough for me to be courteous. They have a daughter, Hazel, who is 5, and Hazel is the reason I have kept my mouth shut about a great many things I might otherwise have said. They moved into a house on the next county over about 3 years ago, a new build in one of those developments where the lawns are all the same shade of green and the mailboxes match. Brittany's father, a man named Curtis Webb, owns a real estate and land acquisitions firm out of Knoxville. I had met him twice. The first time he looked at my house and asked Wesley, in a tone he meant to be helpful, whether I had ever considered what the land underneath it might be worth to the right buyer. The second time he did not bother to look at the house at all. He looked at me, which was somehow worse. I did not say anything either time. Earl had taught me that silence is not the absence of an answer. Sometimes it is just the answer arriving on its own schedule. My sister Patty had her stroke on a Tuesday in early November. The call came from her neighbor just after 7 in the morning, and I was on the road to Chattanooga inside of 20 minutes with a duffel bag and the directions written on the back of a power bill. I left the house unlocked. I always do. There is nothing in it worth taking, or so most people would assume. Brittany had a key. She had always had a key. I would be gone for 9 days. Chattanooga in November has a particular kind of gray to it, the kind that settles into the seams of the buildings and does not lift until afternoon, if it lifts at all. The hospital was on the east side of the city, a long brick building with a parking deck that smelled of damp concrete and the disinfectant they use on the elevator buttons. I parked on the 4th level and walked down because the elevators were slow, and I needed the time on the stairs to gather myself before I saw my sister. Patty was 68. She had been a schoolteacher for 31 years and had retired the previous spring with plans to finally do nothing, which was a thing she had been threatening to do for the better part of 2 decades. The stroke had hit her on the left side, and when I came through the door of her room she was awake but tilted slightly in the bed the way a sapling looks after a hard wind has passed through. Her right hand worked. Her left did not yet. The doctor came in about an hour after I arrived and told me what they tell every family in a room like that. There were some things they could not know yet. The next several days would tell us more than they could. I sat with her. That was what I had come to do. In the evenings I slept on the fold-out chair in the corner of her room, and in the mornings I went down to the cafeteria and drank coffee that tasted like the inside of an aluminum pot, and I made my phone calls from the small courtyard out back where there was a bench under a magnolia tree that had already dropped most of its leaves. I called Wesley on the second night to tell him where I was. He said he was sorry to hear about Patty and asked if there was anything he could do. I told him the house was unlocked the way it always was, and that if a package came, he could let it sit on the porch, that no one in Roane County had ever stolen a package off my porch, and I did not expect they would start now. He laughed a little, the way he does when he is tired, and said he would check on the place. He did not mention Brittany. I did not ask. On the fourth day, Patty squeezed my hand with her left fingers for the first time since I had arrived. It was a small thing, the kind of squeeze a child gives you when they are pretending to be asleep and want you to know they are not. I sat there for a long time and looked at our two hands on the white hospital blanket, hers a little smaller than mine and both of them carrying the same freckles in the same places, the way sisters' hands sometimes do. On the fifth day, Wesley called me. His voice had the particular flatness that I had learned to recognize over the years, the flatness of a man who has decided to deliver a piece of information without coloring it. He said Brittany had been over to the house. He said she had brought Hazel with her, that Hazel had wanted to see Mamaw's chickens, and that while they were out there, Brittany had walked around the property a little. He said she had mentioned the truck. I asked him what she had mentioned about it. He hesitated. Then he said that Brittany thought, since I was not driving it and since it had been sitting under the carport for 2 years now, it might be a good idea to see if anyone would take it off our hands. He used the word our. I noticed that. He said she knew somebody who bought up old vehicles for parts. He said she had only mentioned it. I told him that the truck belonged to me and that it was not for sale. He said, of course, he knew that. He had told her the same thing, that he was only passing the conversation along. I told him I appreciated the call. When we hung up, I sat on the bench under the magnolia tree for a long while and looked at the bare branches against the gray sky and did not feel anything in particular yet. I was simply nodding it, the way you note weather moving in from the west. On the 7th day, Patty moved her left foot. The therapist came in that afternoon and worked with her for about 40 minutes, and afterward Patty looked at me from the pillow and said, in a voice that was not quite hers yet but was close enough, that she was tired of being looked at by strangers. I told her I was tired of looking at the magnolia tree out back. She gave me half a smile, which on the left side was still slow in arriving, and I counted it as the best news I had received in a week. That evening I called Wesley to give him an update. He answered on the second ring. He sounded distracted. There was a television on somewhere behind him and I could hear Hazel in the background asking somebody a question about a juice box. He said it was good to hear that Aunt Patty was making progress. He said the house was fine. He said everything was fine. I asked him if Brittany had been back over. There was a small pause. He said she had stopped by once to check on the chickens, that she had wanted to make sure they had water with the cold snap coming in. He said it the way a person says a thing they have rehearsed, even slightly, even just in passing through their own head before they put it into the air. I have raised a son. I know the sound. I told him I appreciated her checking on the chickens, and I let the conversation move on to other things. And when we hung up, I sat on the fold-out chair in the corner of Patty's hospital room and looked at the dark window for a while. Patty was sleeping. The hallway outside her door had quieted down the way hospital hallways do after 9 in the evening, when the visitors have gone home, and the night nurses come on with their softer shoes. I did not call anyone else that night. There was nothing to call about yet. What I had was a feeling, and feelings on their own are not worth acting on. Earl used to say that a man who reacts to a feeling without facts is a man who ends up apologizing for things he did not need to do. I had carried that with me for a long time. It had served me well. On the 9th morning, the doctor told me Patty was stable enough to be moved to a rehabilitation facility closer to her own home, and Patty's daughter Linda had driven down from Knoxville to take over the next stretch of the watching. Linda was a steady woman in her 40s who taught middle school history and who handled hard things the way her mother had always handled them, with a clipboard and a list and no wasted motion. I hugged my sister carefully on the side that worked, and I told her I would be back the following week. She squeezed my hand again, harder this time, and told me to drive safely. I drove home with the radio off. It is about 140 miles from Chattanooga to my place in Roane County if you take the back roads, which I always do, and the drive took me almost 4 hours because I stopped twice, once for gas, and once at a diner outside of Spring City where I ate a bowl of vegetable soup and watched the rain start up against the window. I was not in a hurry. I had been in a hospital chair for 9 days and my back wanted the long way home. The light was already going by the time I turned onto my road. The trees along the county route had dropped most of their color in the time I had been gone, and the asphalt was wet from the afternoon rain, and the air coming in through the cracked window smelled the way it always smells out here in November, like wet leaves and wood smoke, and something older than either of those. I came around the last bend before my driveway and slowed down the way I always do, because there is a culvert there that the county has been promising to fix for 15 years. Then I looked up at the carport. The carport was empty. I sat in the driveway for a moment with the engine running and looked at the place where the truck had been. There is a shape that a thing leaves behind when it has sat in the same spot for a long time. The concrete under the carport was darker in the rectangle where Earl's truck had stood for 2 years, and the leaves that the wind had pushed in around the edges had not made it into that rectangle yet. The outline of the truck was still there, just in the absence of itself, the way a picture leaves a mark on a wall when you finally take it down. I turned off the engine. I sat for another moment. Then I got out of the car and walked across the gravel to the carport and stood inside that empty rectangle and looked down at the concrete under my boots. The keys were not on the hook by the back door. I checked when I went inside. The hook was empty, and the small ceramic dish where I sometimes left the spare set was empty too. The house itself looked the way I had left it. The dishes I had washed before leaving were still in the drying rack. The mail had been brought in and stacked neatly on the kitchen table, which told me Wesley had been by at some point, because Brittany would not have bothered. There was a faint smell of Brittany's perfume in the front room, the kind of sweet floral thing she wore that always sat in a room for a day or two after she had been in it, but the smell was old. She had not been there that day. I put my duffel bag down on the kitchen chair. I went to the back door and opened it and walked out to the carport again and stood there for a while longer in the cold air with my coat still on. Then I went inside and called Wesley. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting for the call. I asked him where the truck was. He took a breath. He said he had been meaning to tell me. He said Brittany had handled it while I was gone, that she had thought she was being helpful, that a man she knew had come by and offered cash for it, and she had taken the offer because she figured the truck was just sitting there and the money would be useful. I asked him how much. He hesitated. Then he said $500. I did not say anything for a moment. There is a quality of silence that has its own weight on a phone line, and I let that weight sit between us for as long as it needed to sit there. Wesley did not fill it. To his credit, he did not try. When I spoke, I asked him whether he had known about it before it happened. He said no. He said Brittany had told him afterward. He said he was sorry, that he should have come over himself when I left, that he should have changed the locks on the back door before he went home that first night. He said a great many things in a row the way a person does when they are trying to outrun the part of the conversation they do not want to arrive at. I let him finish. Then I asked him who she had sold it to. He did not know the name. He said the man had been a friend of one of Curtis's business contacts. He said Brittany had not given him a receipt. He said he would find out. I told him to find out tonight. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen with the phone still in my hand and looked at the window above the sink where the last of the daylight was going blue against the foothills. What Brittany had not asked, what she had not even known to ask, was why a man like Earl Calloway would have spent the last 6 months of his life on his back under that truck with a welding torch and a small steel box he had built with his own hands. She had seen an old vehicle. She had seen $500. She had not seen what was welded to the underside of the frame. Earl built the box in the spring of the year he died. He did not tell me about it at first. That was not unusual. Earl had a way of working through a thing in his own head for weeks before he brought it into a conversation, and I had learned a long time ago not to crowd him while he was doing that. He would come in from the shop with grease on his forearms and a quiet look around his eyes, and I would put a plate in front of him and ask about the weather, and we would let the rest arrive when it was ready to arrive. He started spending more time under the truck around April. I noticed because his back had been bothering him for months by then, and getting down on the creeper and rolling underneath was not the easy thing for him that it had been at 50. He would be out there for an hour at a stretch, sometimes longer, and I would hear the small clinks of his tools on the concrete and the occasional bright hiss of the welder. And I would look out the kitchen window and see the blue flicker of the arc through the gap between the carport and the side of the shop. One evening in late May, he came inside and washed his hands at the kitchen sink for longer than he needed to, and then he sat down at the table across from me and looked at me with the particular steadiness he used when a thing was going to be important. He told me what was under the truck. He told me he had been thinking about it for a while. He told me he was not afraid exactly, but that he had watched his own father go without warning at 63 and his older brother go at 58, and that he had decided some time ago that he would not leave me trying to find things in the wrong places at the wrong time. He told me where the box was. He told me how it opened. He told me what was in it in plain terms without flourish, the way he told me most things that mattered. I listened. I did not interrupt him. When he was finished, I asked him one question. I asked him why he had welded it under the truck instead of putting it in the bank. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said the bank was a place other people knew about. He said the truck was a place no one would ever think to look. He said a thing that belonged to a family ought to stay inside that family until the family was ready for it, and that if anything ever happened where I needed help and the help needed to come quickly and quietly, the truck would still be in the driveway and the box would still be underneath it, and I would not have to ask permission from anyone to get to what was mine. I asked him whether Wesley knew. He said no. He said Wesley was a good son and he loved him, but that Wesley had married a woman whose father was the kind of man who counted other people's pockets in his head, and that he did not want a piece of paper sitting in a file cabinet somewhere with Wesley's name on it that Brittany's family might one day come across by accident or by looking. He said it the way Earl said hard things, without anger, just with the steady clarity of a man who had thought about it long enough to be sure. He said that when the time came, I would know what to do. I told him I would. He died 4 months later in September of a heart attack in the front yard while he was raking leaves. I found him about 20 minutes after. The doctor said it had been quick. I have spent the years since then trying to decide whether quick is a mercy or a theft, and I have not yet decided. After the funeral, I did not move the truck. I knew what was under it. For 2 years it had sat in the carport, and no one had ever asked. Until Brittany had needed $500. Wesley called me back at 9:15 that night. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I had not drunk and a notepad I had not written on. The house was quiet the way it gets when the wood stove has been out for a few days and the walls have not yet remembered they are supposed to be warm. He had a name. He said the man Brittany had sold the truck to was named Dwayne Pickett, that he ran a salvage and parts yard off Highway 70 on the way toward Harriman, and that he was, according to Brittany, a perfectly reasonable person who paid cash and did not ask questions. Wesley said it in the flat tone he had been using for most of the evening, the tone of a man who has stopped trying to make a story sound better than it is. I asked him if Brittany had been told why the truck mattered. He said no. He said he had not gone into it with her. He said she had cried when he came home and confronted her, that she had said she was only trying to help, that the truck had been sitting there rusting and she had thought I would be relieved. I asked him if he believed that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he did not entirely know what he believed about his wife right now. He said that was a hard thing to say out loud and he was sorry to say it to me. I told him I appreciated him being honest with me, that honesty was a thing I would always rather have than comfort, and that we would talk more in the morning. I hung up. I sat with a cup of tea and looked at the dark window for a long time. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a man named Roy Hatcher. Roy had been Earl's closest friend for almost 40 years. They had worked together at the same plant for 2 decades, and after they both retired, they had spent most Saturdays in Roy's garage taking apart and putting back together whatever machine happened to be on the bench that month. Roy was 74 now and lived alone since his wife had passed the previous spring, and he answered the phone the way he always answered it, with his last name and nothing else. I told him what had happened. Roy did not say anything for a while. Then he asked me one question. He asked me if the box was still under it. I told him I did not know yet. I told him that was what I needed his help finding out. He said he would be at my house at 7 in the morning. He said to put coffee on. The second call I made was to a woman named Iris Calloway. Iris was Earl's younger sister, 63 years old, a lawyer in Knoxville who had spent most of her career in estate and family law and the rest of it not suffering fools. We had been close for 30 years in the particular way that women who marry into a family become close with the sister who was already there. I told her what had happened and what I knew so far. I told her I was not yet asking her to do anything, that I was asking her to listen. She listened. When I was finished, she asked me whether Brittany had signed anything when she had taken the money from Dwayne Pickett. I told her I did not know. She said that was the first thing we would want to find out. She said a vehicle title in Tennessee did not transfer on a handshake, that Dwayne Pickett either had a signed title in his hand or he did not, and that the answer to that question changed almost everything about the conversations that came next. I told her I would call her back when I knew more. She told me to sleep if I could. She said tomorrow was going to be a long day, and a long day was easier on a person who had slept than on a person who had not. I told her I would try. I did not sleep much, but I lay down, which was something. Roy pulled into the driveway at 6:53. I heard his truck before I saw it, the way you always hear Roy's truck, a low diesel rattle that has been the same sound for as long as I have known him. He came in through the back door without knocking, took his cap off, hung it on the peg by the door the way he had hung it there 100 times when Earl was alive, and went to the cabinet where I kept the mugs without asking which one was his. He drank his coffee standing up. Roy has never sat down for a first cup of coffee in his life. After he had finished it, he set the mug on the counter and said, "All right, let us go find out." We drove in his truck. It was a 40-minute ride out to Dwayne Pickett's salvage yard, west on the county road, and then south on Highway 70 through the kind of country that flattens out a little before the river. The sky was clear and cold, and the light was that particular thin yellow that November mornings give you before the sun has fully committed to the day. Neither of us talked much on the drive. Roy had been Earl's friend, and there are some kinds of company that do not require filling. The salvage yard sat behind a chain-link fence with a sliding gate and a hand-painted sign that said Pickett Auto and parts in letters that had faded to about half their original red. The gate was open. Roy pulled in and parked next to a small office trailer that had a propane tank chained to the side of it and a window unit hanging crooked above the door. I told Roy I would do the talking. He nodded. He said he would be right behind me. He said it in the tone Earl used to use when he meant a thing without needing to elaborate on it, and I understood. Dwayne Pickett was about 50 years old, heavy through the middle, with a gray mustache and the kind of complexion that comes from too many years of working outside and too many years of doing it with a cigarette in his hand. He was sitting behind a metal desk inside the trailer when I came in, and he looked up from a clipboard with the polite, faintly cautious expression of a man who has learned to be careful around women of a certain age who walk into his office without an appointment. I told him my name. He blinked once. He set the clipboard down. I told him I was there about a 1976 Ford F-250 that he had purchased earlier in the week from a woman named Brittany Calloway. I told him the truck belonged to me, that it had not been hers to sell, and that I was there to find out what paperwork he had on the transaction. Dwayne Pickett did not say anything for a moment. He looked past me at Roy, who was standing by the door with his hands in his coat pockets, and Roy nodded at him in a friendly way that was not actually friendly. Dwayne looked back at me. He said he had paid cash. He said the woman who brought it had told him she was the owner. He said he had no reason to doubt her. I asked him if he had a signed title. He said he had a bill of sale. He said the title itself, the woman had said she would mail to him once she located it, that it had been her father-in-law's truck and the paperwork was somewhere in the house and she would find it. I told him she would not be finding it. I told him that title was in my name, that it had been in my name for 49 years, and that it was currently in a fireproof box on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, where it had been for every one of those 49 years. Dwayne Pickett's face changed. He asked me to sit down. I sat down. Roy stayed standing by the door. Dwayne pulled a folder from a drawer. He opened it. He said, "Well now." The bill of sale was a single sheet of paper. Brittany had signed her own name at the bottom in her own handwriting in the loopy cursive she had used on Christmas cards for the past 7 years. The line above her signature said, "Seller represents that they are the lawful owner of the vehicle described above and has the right to convey title." I read it twice. I handed it back to Dwayne Pickett across the desk. I asked him where the truck was now. He said it was still on the lot. He said he had not started parting it out yet. He said he had been planning to pull the engine the following week, that it was a clean old motor and worth a few dollars to the right buyer, and that the body was rough enough he had figured he would crush the rest of it after. I asked him if he would walk me out to it. He said he would. The three of us went out the back door of the trailer and across the gravel lot, past rows of cars and trucks in various stages of being taken apart, some of them stacked too high, some of them with their hoods open and their engines already gone. The morning was cold enough that you could see your breath, and the gravel crunched under our boots the way frozen gravel does. Earl's truck was about halfway down the third row, parked at an angle next to a yellow 70s-era pickup that had no doors. Seeing it sitting there did something to me that I will not try to put into words. I will only say that I stood for a moment in front of it and put my hand on the hood the way I used to put my hand on Earl's shoulder when he came in from the shop. The metal was cold under my palm. Roy came up beside me. He looked at the truck and he looked at me and he did not say anything. I turned to Dwayne Pickett. I told him I would be buying the truck back from him. I told him I would pay him what he had paid Brittany in cash that morning, and that I would also pay him an additional $200 for the inconvenience and the storage. I told him in exchange he would hand me the bill of sale that Brittany had signed, and that he would write me a receipt indicating that the vehicle and all of its contents were being returned to its lawful owner. Dwayne Pickett looked at me for a long moment. Then he said that sounded fair. He said he would also like to add, for his own peace of mind, that he had not known. that he was not in the business of buying things from people who did not own them, and that if he had known, he would not have written the check. He said it the way a man says a thing he needs you to hear because he is going to have to live with himself afterward. I told him I believed him. I did. There was no profit in not believing him, and there was a kind of honesty in his face that I had learned over many years to recognize. Roy went out to his truck and came back with the cash. I do not know where Roy keeps that kind of money, and I have never asked him. He counted out $700 on the corner of Dwayne Pickett's desk. Dwayne wrote out the receipt by hand on a sheet of yellow paper, and he signed it, and he handed me the bill of sale that Brittany had signed, and I folded both papers and put them in the inside pocket of my coat. Dwayne walked us back out to the truck. He found the keys on a hook inside the office. He handed them to me. I asked Roy if he would drive Earl's truck home for me. I told him I would drive his. Roy took the keys and looked at me carefully. He said, "You do not want to look first." I told him not yet. I told him I wanted the truck inside my own carport on my own concrete before I looked. He nodded. We drove the 40 miles home in 2 trucks. Roy backed the truck into the carport at 10:15. The tires settled into the same rectangle of darker concrete they had sat on for 2 years. And from the kitchen window, the view looked again the way it had looked every morning since Earl had stopped driving. I stood at the back door for a moment and watched Roy get out of the cab and close the door carefully, the way he closed everything, and I thought about how some things in a life come back to the place they belong and some do not, and how a person learns over the years to be grateful for either one when it happens. Roy had brought the creeper from his garage. He laid it on the concrete beside the truck and looked at me. I told him I would do it. He said he figured I would. I am 71 years old and my knees are not what they were, but I have spent a lifetime around men who worked under vehicles, and I knew how to lay myself on a creeper and how to roll under a frame without putting my hands where they did not belong. Roy held the flashlight. I rolled under. The box was where Earl had said it would be. It was welded to the inside of the frame rail just behind the cab, on the driver's side, in a place where a person would have to be looking for it to find it, and would have to know what they were looking at even then. Earl had welded a thin steel plate over the front of it so that from any normal angle it looked like part of the frame itself, like a reinforcement bracket of the kind old trucks sometimes have. The seam was clean. Earl's welds were always clean. The latch was on the underside, recessed. You had to know to reach up and press in the right place. I pressed. The plate swung down on a small hinge Earl had built into it, and the box opened. Inside, in a sealed plastic bag, was an envelope. I pulled it out carefully and held it against my chest for a moment under the truck in the dark with Roy's flashlight angled away so it would not be in my eyes. Then I rolled back out. Roy helped me up. He did not ask what was in the envelope. He went into the kitchen and put fresh coffee on because that is what Roy does when a moment needs to settle, and I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the bag and laid the envelope in front of me. Inside the envelope were 3 things. The first was a folded sheet of paper in Earl's handwriting, dated the May before he died. It was a letter to me. I will not write down here what it said. Some things a husband says to his wife should stay between the 2 of them, and Earl had written it to me, not to anyone else. The second was a small leather pouch. Inside the pouch were 8 gold coins, American Eagles, 1 ounce each, that Earl had bought slowly over many years out of the cash he made on side welding jobs, the kind of jobs he was paid for in envelopes and never deposited. I had known about the coins. I had not known where he had kept them. I knew now. The third was a deed. It was a deed to 22 acres of land in Loudoun County in Earl's name that he had purchased outright in 1988 from a man he had done a long welding job for, a man who had paid him partly in money and partly in dirt. Earl had never built on the land. He had never mentioned it to anyone except me, and even then only once, the night he had told me about the box. The land sat on a ridge above a stretch of the Tennessee River that Curtis Webb's firm had been trying to acquire pieces of for the past 4 years. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the 3 things laid out in front of me. Roy set a cup of coffee at my elbow. He did not say anything. I called Iris. Iris drove out from Knoxville that same afternoon. She came in through the back door the way family does, set her briefcase on the kitchen table, looked at the 3 things still laid out where I had left them, and sat down without taking off her coat. She read Earl's letter to me only at the part where he had given her permission to read it, which was the last paragraph. Earl had thought of everything. He had named her in the letter as the person I should call. He had written it almost 3 years before she would ever get the call, and he had been right about her, the way he had been right about most people in the end. She picked up the deed. She read it through twice. She looked at me over her reading glasses and asked me if I had any idea what the land was worth. I told her I did not. She said, in the careful voice she used for important things, that she would find out by Monday, but that based on what she already knew about the parcels along that ridge and what Curtis Webb's firm had been paying for far less, the figure was almost certainly in the high six figures, possibly more. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her about Brittany. Iris had been thinking about Brittany on the drive out. She said the bill of sale was signed fraud. She said it plainly without softening it, because that was what it was. Brittany had signed her own name to a document representing that she was the lawful owner of a vehicle she did not own, and she had taken $500 for it. In Tennessee, that was a crime. It was a small crime in the eyes of the law, the kind that rarely got prosecuted when the parties were family, but it was a crime nonetheless. The bill of sale was sitting in my inside coat pocket with Brittany's signature on it. We could do whatever we chose to do with it. Iris asked me what I wanted. I thought about that for a long time. I told her I did not want Brittany prosecuted. I told her Hazel was 5 years old, and Hazel did not need a story about her mother that started with a courtroom. But I told her I wanted Brittany to know what she had nearly done. I wanted her to know, in writing, exactly what had been welded under that truck. I wanted Curtis Webb to know it too. I wanted both of them to understand, on a page with letterhead and a lawyer's signature at the bottom, that the family they had spent 7 years quietly looking down on had been sitting on more land along the river than Curtis's firm had managed to assemble in a decade of trying, and that none of it was for sale. Iris wrote the letter that evening at my kitchen table. It went out on Monday. Wesley came over on Wednesday by himself. He sat at the kitchen table where Iris had sat, and he did not take off his coat either. He told me Brittany had read the letter twice and then had not spoken for almost an hour. He told me Curtis Webb had called the house that night and had spoken to Brittany in a voice Wesley could hear through 2 walls, and that Brittany had cried for a long time afterward, and that the next morning she had asked Wesley if he thought I would ever forgive her. I told Wesley that forgiveness was a different question from trust, and that the two of them were going to have to learn the difference the slow way, the way most people learn it. I told him I loved him. I told him I loved Hazel. I told him my door was open to both of them the way it had always been open, and that Brittany was welcome at my table when she was ready to come to it as a guest and not as an inventory. He cried a little. He had not cried in front of me since he was about 9. I put my hand on his. Outside the kitchen window, the truck sat in the carport where it belonged. Earl had been right. When the time had come, I had known what to do.